that was actually the task to talk about open neuroimaging. And then I thought, well, what would the crowd look like? And do they want another happy story? And probably you won't want one. So I went for something else. Still related to the topic, so it's not completely abstruse. So just a quick run through to where I'm coming from the science perspective. I think we should be able to read those images, and not in the sense of which of 4 alternatives is this. We should really understand what this is, and some other people who got rewarded by the system agree with that perspective. And I don't think reading those images should result in a paper. It should result in something that somebody can build. Probably in China, that you can buy and use, right? To read out the state of a complex, organism part like the brain. And I think everybody agrees with me. This is utopia, and that's not in 5 years. It's not in 10 years. It's probably not in 20 years. But the state with which we are struggling is still to make a distinction between what is noise and what is inter-individual variability, what is intra-individual variability. We basically have very little clue about things. And if I would have time and I would have stick to the topic, I would have told you that there is stuff that you can do in terms of functional alignment, go away from sensor space, go towards cortical tuning functions and so on. I would have shown you a few bits where you can do almost magic things by applying a small linear transformation, and that would lead you to something that you could capture as a labeled high-dimensional brain state space that you could use to read out things, and then I would have confessed that I'm a psychologist, and there are ways to get a sense of high-dimensional spaces by asking lots of questions and doing factor analysis and all kinds of stuff, and then I would have be depressed to tell you that this is an intractable problem that we are not capable of solving because there's just too much data, too many dimensions, too much money that would be required, so no individual lab can do that. And then I would have raised your spirits again and show you that in synthetic biology, they have attacked problems like this and are very successfully doing so on a year-by-year basis, doing pretty much some sort of institutionalized crowdfunding of innovation, which is really impressive. And I think we should have something like this in neuroimaging. In open neuroimaging. That's the connection, right? So I won't tell you any about that. What I will do is I will just say that in order to try to push in the direction of that movement, we released an open data set now 4 years ago and published that in Scientific Data, which basically we had data recorded from people listening to a version of the movie Forrest Gump for the blind in a 7T for 2 hours, and recorded everything else that the machine can do. And then we just released that data. No hypothesis-driven project whatsoever. We did QA analysis of the data. We did nothing else, hoping that it would be attractive to some people so they could pick it up. And then we invested a few more years of work, and now this is a data set where you have, for some participants, over 14 hours of fMRI of various types, rich annotations of the movie stimulus. You can have that if you want, all kinds of structural data analysis. And I think it's a really cool thing. It's in the public domain. You don't need to go to any sort of pretty fancy repository and sign off something. You just go to that site, studyforest.org. You get an overview of the papers and the studies that used it and so on. You could go and play with it. Now, the reason why we published this was we wanted to attract collaborations pretty much without actually having to collaborate with these people. Just give them something that's well described enough, kind of as a social psychology experiment, if that would be useful or even a sufficient condition for people to work with other people's data. Because everybody who's tried to work with other people's data knows that this is almost, it's not a very pleasant experience most of the time, right? It's written with frustration, underdetermined descriptions, and so on. So the question is, where are we 4 years after the project, and was it worth being open and going into the open? And as of this point, we have 16 additional independent published studies that use the data, and virtually all of them are pursuing questions that we would never have asked. So not a single one of them is a scoop in any sense of the word. There are actually publications among those where I don't even understand what it's about. I don't know the words in the title, which, you know, tells you something about me or about the craziness of the papers. And so you could think of the project as a substantial boost in return of investment of the taxpayer, right? Because they paid for the acquisition of that data set once, independent of what its purpose was, and they're still getting revenue. So those 16 published papers are not the end of the thing, right? Things are happening all the time, and there's a publication from here too. So I think the positive takeaway is that it inspired work like this by others. So now you can see many more data sets like this pop up. I'm not saying that this is the causal trigger for this kind of thing, but it just helps to, you know, amass a critical mass. But did we make the most out of it? I don't think so, and not in the slightest. Every 2 weeks probably, there is a group approaching me saying, oh, okay, can we have this and that? And I say, sure you can. Do you have data like this? And say, yeah, it's not published, but sure you can. And they all promise like back contributions into the project by making their own stuff public. And up until very, very recently, those have all been seemingly empty promises. Now we know that scientific projects take a while, so I don't know, what is the reason for that. Maybe they didn't find anything, or anything could be the case. But I'm constantly giving people access, and there is literally nothing coming back, right? So in the sense of having kicked off something that is then some sort of perpetual machine, it's just a giant failure. That's what it is. And what's even more embarrassing is that the starting point for users trying to use that data set today is pretty much exactly identical to the point 4 years ago, which is an entire PhD life cycle, right? There should have been something, but other than the additional data that we put into the data set, almost nothing happened. This is about to change, I think, but it's just give you a sense of how long things take. So the question is, why? Like, why is it not going, everybody talking about open science, things will be faster, and you do things and pre-register, and, knowledge amassing will just be almost instant, and it's just not going to happen from my perspectives. So the question is, anything that we can take away? And one thing that is really critical is that everyone who's attempting open science should understand that whenever you're special, you're doing it wrong. And we were special in the beginning because there was no bids at that point where you could, this metadata standard or file structuring standard that you could put your data into. So we went with the thing that we felt was the most prolific at the time, which was an OpenFMRI data portal in-house standard, and it just turned out not to scale. Right? So we participated in this reporting standards effort that was mentioned before, in the development of the BIT standard, and also in the project with Stephen on how to structure and what are the important aspects in sharing analysis code. In order to have something that can be referred to, then say, I'm just doing what is described in there, and you don't have to follow me, you can follow this community effort, and give people a sense that their investment in sticking to something is not just a one-off thing that will invalidate itself in 6 months, but it's something that is really a worthwhile investment. So I kind of speculated that somebody would have mentioned the FAIR principles at this point in this audience. Nobody did. I don't have the time to go about them, but there is a thing, an acronym really, that was discovered, how to describe how data should be, and it's fair. They should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And if you go to this thing, Go Fair, you can read all about this. It's not really a new discovery. Like there were iterations of this thought before, but I think to date this is the most compact, most comprehensible description of what it involves. These are the first level principles. I'm not even going through them. They turn out to be more complicated than one would hope for to actually implement them for any sort of data portal and data set. And they certainly don't seem to be targeted towards an individual researcher like a PhD student, but more like an effort how it should be in general for an institution, for a data portal, and that kind of thing. There's one thing that I find missing for some reason in all this discussion about the FAIR principles as a direct experience from working with our data set and working with other people working with our data set, which is the time dimension, right? And the thing is, if you do open science, right, and open science in the sense of I give something to the general public in order to have the general public be able to do something with it, right, then that's a process that by definition cannot really have an end, right? So at the moment where you stop investing in that thing that you shared, you're basically starting the stopwatch when it will make itself obsolete. Why is that? Because even if you have something that is fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable today, right, the world is constantly changing. And code that runs today will not run tomorrow. It's almost guaranteed that it won't run tomorrow. If you put something in a fancy data repository that is really awesome today, it's replaced by some other thing tomorrow, and your thing will not be findable and won't be as accessible anymore. So the time dimension really has to be factored into the process, and it's not. And if you're thinking about, oh, you know, if data is really an artifact, right? Once I have it, it's fixed. That is not the case, because the data we work with is not a natural observation, like a stone that I pick up and put into a closet. It's a digital object that has an evolution even at the point where you think it's raw, right? There have been things done to it, and in order to put it into a releasable form, you do many more things to it, and they all involve software written by people who are not software developers. It's guaranteed to be buggy. There will be things that are broken, and if you look at the changelog of the Study Forest dataset, you'll find tons of them. Tons of things that were broken. And our entire sharing infrastructure is not capable of dealing with it. If you go to the official repositories, the officially recognized repositories that scientific data mandates, for example, they exclusively have an outdated version of the Study Forest dataset that is buggy as hell, because there is no update mechanism, right? And that's kind of strange, right? Especially if software developers are working with GitHub, right? It's kind of weird, right? Why is data something other than, like, it's bits, and one is fixed and the other one is allowed to change, and it's just not working. And it translates also to the data representation, right? Bits today is the hot thing that everybody uses. It will, I guarantee you, that eventually be replaced by something that is even better than that, even if nobody can think about it right now. And all the data in bits format right now will need to get an update to the other standard. And there is no infrastructure or even a mindset in place in order to do that. So what we tried over the past 3 years is to take what we've learned from working with the data sets and other open data sets and turn it into a tool that is capable of helping with some aspects of this. And the tool is called DataLet, and it's basically a software suite that aids managing the evolution of digital objects. Not only code, not only data, but the combination of everything that involves digital workflows for science. And as on the sidelines, it also yields fair resources that you could share if you are inclined to do so. But it's built into the thing, but it's not a requirement. Not everything needs to be shared. So few points on the principles that underlie this software before I will give a few examples. I will only be able to scratch the surface. It is a general purpose tool, so it's not specific to neuroimaging or to neuroscience or to anything that could be associated with a single domain. It only cares about two things: data sets and files, right? We all work with files. Most people work with files. Not everybody works with files. Some people work with database servers. This thing cares about data sets, which is a collection of files and folders, the things that we have on our computers and work with. And the smallest unit in it is a file. That's what it cares about. So it's basically a content management system that operates on the units of files. A data set in DataLad is a Git repository. So what we've learned in the previous talk about what we can use Git for to track versions and so on applies to everything that's managed by DataLad equally well, because it uses the same technology underneath. Purpose of this technology is, or the advantage of this technology is, it's not science specific. The entire planet uses this. If this goes away, it will be replaced by something that is guaranteed to be better, or we have the zombie apocalypse, and there will be a massive transition to go from this system to whatever the next system is that I don't have to pay for. And that's a huge, huge advantage. So in addition, a data set can have a so-called annex that is optional, which makes it possible to track terabytes and petabytes of content in a Git repository, something that you cannot do with Git directly, because it becomes really, really slow once you exceed a few gigabytes. We use a tool called Git Annex, which is pure magic. It's written in a language that nobody understands. It has a bus factor of 1, sadly, if you know all about the bus factor, but it's absolutely magical, and it's not a scientific project. Some of you might know about the Internet Archive, right? They back up the internet, which sounds like a lot, right? That's done with Git Annex, for example. So it can handle things. There's one, let's call it social principle that we have deep in the core of DataLad, which is we do things in a way that don't introduce custom data structures that cannot be understood after this project dies, right? And it will die. I guarantee you that. We have a bus factor of 5 at the moment. We're right, in the median, and that means it will die at some point. It's not that reliant on external funding right now, but it will die. So the question is, if you adopt that, are you willing to bet your career on mine? And probably you won't. And so anything that you do in here actually uses data structures that are not specific to this application. They're specific to something that is globally used. And other than that, relies on text file formats that are properly marked up so you could understand them in a sort of software archaeology type of sense. And we have complete decentralization in the system. So there's no requirement at any point to maintain a central infrastructure that somebody needs to pay for. Like your laptop is a perfectly capable central infrastructure that this thing can use. But in addition, it is made to use pretty much all the central infrastructure that we have, from Figshare to GitHub to institutional repositories whatsoever. We should be able to interface with that, maybe minimal adjustment if you're really special, but there is no required central infrastructure, but you can harvest all the benefits from central infrastructure if you want. And that's pretty much what it is, and which is sufficiently abstract to not understand a single thing. So I'll give you a few examples of how it looks like. DataLad in its core is a command line interface, so it has a command line interface and a Python API, so I'll show you actual code. It's almost trivial to put that into UI if somebody would have the resources and sufficient energy to do it. But right now it's an infrastructure tool. So here is how it looks like to obtain a data set from some sort of database. Doesn't matter what it is. What you say is DataLad install, and you give the URL for the data set. That's it. Like that's like downloading a file. Internally, it actually has globally unique identifiers for both the data set, what it stands for, what its semantic purpose is in life, and the location of where a data set has its data content that it tracks, which could be many. Those are internally, as users, we don't want to see them. That's why it goes this way. So what happens is you get some sort of local representation of what is on the server without actually having to have all the data. So in general, this is just a few kilobytes or megabytes that you have. And now you can get individual file content in that data set by just asking for, give me the content of the file that is at this path, right? So you see a normal, regular representation of the data set content in your file browser, right? It just doesn't have any content until it is obtained. And internally, this is all referenced by cryptographic hashes, so you know precisely what version of a file you're working with, and anything that you do with that knows that it used this specific version of that file, not even the entire data set release. So, but the entire data set also maintains an idea of history. So you can have a local version. It's a decentralized system, right? So you have a local version of that data set, like a local Git repository, and the database might introduce an update, and you can ask DataLed just to update the information that it knows about all the other locations, and that information becomes available here, and you can do things like DataLed, update me the local one, and all the files that I obtained before, right, which might be a subset of what is actually in the data set. You have a big data set, and you're only interested in 2 files. You don't want to have the 2 terabytes that it contains, right? Only the 2 files. If you run this line, it will get the new version from the database and then re-obtain the content of the files that you were interested in, and only those, and update them if you want that. So it's quite neat. So all of that, what I've described so far, you could do if you're sufficiently proficient with Git and Git Annex. You could do more or less by hand. It wouldn't be as compact as this one, but it's all doable. What those tools cannot do is interlink those data sets. So we can nest data set into each other, which sounds abstract, but I'll give you an example in a second. So technically it looks like this. I tell DataLed to install into the data set that is in the current folder another data set that is obtained from this URL under this name, right? And what happens is that this is just a representation of the change in the Git content. So it really is a few lines of text. It weighs a few bytes, therefore. So connecting data sets is really a lightweight thing. But what it enables you to do is you can now compose data analysis project trees out of modular components that come from different sources and are taken care of by different people and have their different evolutions, and you still have a consistent tree that you know precisely which version of which piece you're using to produce particular analysis outputs. So if you go through here, this is an analysis folder, project A, right? It has a code directory that contains a reference. This is like a dataset link to a Git repository of a third-party library that your code is using. You can have other stuff in here. There's stuff that you track directly in the repository of that analysis because it's relevant for that analysis. What is the analysis about? Where was it published? That kind of thing. You link in input data, pre-processed data. Right? If you have a raw data set, you pre-process it maybe in 4 different ways for particular things, and then from those 4, you can conduct 25 different analyses each. Right? You don't want to duplicate that stuff because somebody has to pay for the disk space. In this thing, you can just say, I want this particular version of that pre-processed flavor of the data set, and I built this analysis from. And all these links are pairwise, so you're not ingesting all the dependencies that you're specifying. They can live wherever they live, and they're obtained on demand whenever you need them. And you can verify programmatically that you have not made any changes to them and throw them away again while retaining the version information. And so you can repeat the process even without having to take care of backups of other people's code, which is really useful if you don't trust these people. And don't trust people, right? They mess things up. If they haven't messed it up right now, they will mess it up over time, I guarantee you. And those dataset linkages could be arbitrarily deep, right? So the pre-processed dataset can reference its original raw dataset to which you might never get access because it's not de-identified, etc. But you have a cryptographic link to the identity of the dataset. So if there's ever any problem, you can at least email the people and tell them, I used this specific version of that thing and I think it's buggy. Can you check that for me, right? Most published open data that you can get anywhere today does not have that ability. You can email those people and they will either ignore you or say, this is really out of our reach. With this one, you can do it. What's even more amazing for me in my day-to-day life is you can now use this technology to also include the transformations that were done to turn pre-processed data into analysis results and capture all the information necessary in the same data sets. So you give it 2 examples of command lines that run. So here's basically what you would do in a command line. You say there's a compute all script that just does it, right? That compute all script is tracked in the version control system, so you know precisely what it did at the time where you ran that command. And DataLed, if you prefix that in the simplest way with DataLed run, it will record that you ran this specific command on this version of the input data, which is also tracked in the dataset, with these parameters and make a record that it is programmatically actionable. So you could rerun the same pipeline that you recorded in that data set on a different flavor of the input data and compare results. And you could do this in a way that a machine understands and can track them, so you don't get confused and your error rate gets minimized. What is even cooler is that nowadays we have computational containers, singularity containers, Docker containers that can encapsulate entire computational environments. These are practically just files. Any file can go in a data set. So you can track the container, like here, a NiLearn container, in the data set. So you're not only capturing the input data, the code that runs, but also the computational environment in which it was executed, and all the parameters that were necessary in order to kick off that computation, and the results that it produced at the same time in the same repository, right? Without having to duplicate any input data whatsoever. So you're really just capturing the essence of what your analysis is about and nothing else. But you keep precise information about nothing else. So what we additionally have is the support to extract, to work with metadata for your data. And metadata is absolute key. It's key for you to rediscover what you actually did. It's key for you to discover who had what scan at which scanner, from what time frame, time window, software version of the scanner, etc. Which type of code you used on what kind of analysis, because it was buggy at the time, so which papers are affected. All metadata is necessary for making those queries. And DataLet is basically, I'll not go through this because I don't have time, but we have support for arbitrary amounts and arbitrary structured metadata in an arbitrary number of metadata standards, right? So whatever metadata standard for whatever purpose you like best today, your opinion will change, and it's guaranteed that your metadata standard of choice is not able to capture something completely different that also needs to be captured. So in DataLite, you don't have to decide for a metadata standard. You can have simultaneously multiple ones supported, which also eases transition from one metadata standard to another. And the key here is that nobody curates metadata manually, because the manual process is the most expensive process that you can think of. If you do it once, you'll never do it again, because now you know how much it costs, right? So at the point where you detach metadata from data, it's basically outdated and wrong. It's just a matter of time. So in DataLab, we do this automatically, and if you want to extract metadata, you have to codify how you get from the data to the metadata. And if you cannot codify it, it's a process you shouldn't attempt anyway, because it's already wrong if you're doing it manually. And that extraction can run repeatedly. So if metadata needs to be updated in a new standard, better markup, better terms, right? A machine can do this, because you just need to change the script that made that metadata extraction. Metadata can also be separated from the data sets and moved into super data sets. So if you think about metadata in the raw DICOM data set of a neuroimaging, it can move all the way up to a data set that contains the manuscript that references the results that you published, that references the pre-processed data, that references the raw data. And at the very top, the data set that you share, you can inquire all the way down to, what was the echo time of the sequence that ran. Because sometimes that's relevant, right? And of course you can decide what kind of information you want to share. What this enables is you can build apps like bits to SciData. Anybody who's submitted a data set to Scientific Data knows they ask you to curate metadata in some fancy way that involves Excel. Based on this metadata representation, this can be automatic. So I could convert your bits metadata in their format in probably, 2 minutes, including the download time that it takes, and you will probably spend a day on it. So I should be paid for that, I think. And this just demo at this point, because the utility of those tools obviously depend on the quality of the metadata, and nobody is taking care of that. Give you one example. Just pay attention to this command. It's longish. It utilizes DataLite's search functionality, which does not require any database server. It's just a flat file search. What this thing does, if you install DataLite on your machine, it will obtain a reference data set that tracks all kinds of data portals, all the data sets in all kinds of data portals. And this is the question that says, give me all the files, this is what this says, all the files that have a bit subject sex property that is female, a bit type property that is T1, and a bit subject age property that is 24. So it gives you the T1s that it knows of all the female 24-year-olds, regardless of where the data was published, right? And this is the visualization of the structured record that you get. This is obviously for machines, but you can see that it represents all the individual metadata side by side. So here's bits, there's nifty metadata. It gives you direct download URLs of where versions of files that have these properties were published, and it tells you what actually matched. So you can see it doesn't have to be a direct reference, and this is all possible without any sort of fancy indexing technology. It takes for 14 terabytes and a million files about a minute 20, right? So if you put that in a database, it becomes faster, but you don't have to. You can publish with data-led. Just briefly, to all kinds of commercial services and institutionally used technologies. You can use data encryption if you think that's necessary for your data. You can have configurable permissions and authorization schemes. So basically, data-led separates the management of data identity and metadata from the actual storage. So you can share information about your data set with people freely and openly, but you can arbitrarily hard lock down access to actual data content, and those could be managed completely separately. So you can use your library to host your data, and they can have whatever procedure to perform authorization, and Data-Lite can just manages the identity. And so data sets are typically lightweight. I have not yet seen a data set that's larger than 10 megabytes for just tracking the identity. You can attach those as a tarball to publications, no problem. They are machine readable. They support redundant storage. So you can insure yourself against failure of your own career. You can insure the data set against failure of your own career, you vanishing from the surface of the scientific planet, from your institution closing down the storage that you picked as the most awesome at the time, right? The closing down of publishers, of data portals like Figshare. They're all commercial entities. They go away. It's guaranteed, right? A data set like this weighs almost nothing and can track identity in multiple places for the same objects at the same time. And of course, it can be updated. And also, the data set is not attached to you. And if you put that on GitHub, that data set, it's compatible with GitHub. You can take it and become the curator of something that you think is a valuable resource for the future, even if the original authors don't think about it anymore. So you can be your own library curator if you want and you can afford it. Data-Lite can do many things, but it's intended to be extended by third parties that don't have to talk to the authors of Data-Lite. So you can write extensions which are separate Python packages that people can install from you. It just pulls in the Data-Lite core pieces. We have stuff to work with containerized environments, stuff to scrape web resources, neuroimaging, base tools, metadata extractors, workflows for automatic bits conversion, that kind of stuff. Everybody wants that. Remote code execution on cluster cloud grid services, a thing that you can build a REST API with it. There's stuff that you can build web UIs for data sets with that you can expose search. And I'll pretty much end with this slide, which shows you what kind of different ways you can connect data sets to each other. So here's the example of a paper. I mentioned it before. Paper references and analysis uses a fMRI prep pre-processed data set that came from a raw data set in bits format that was derived from a raw data set that nobody can have. And those could be hosted on OpenNeuro. OpenNeuro actually using Data-Lite as the storage backend. So they are managing their own data sets. With this one, you can go to GitHub and download all the data sets that are on OpenNeuro with Data-Lite and their entire history, which is quite neat. And all the individual pieces of content in those data sets you can publish to lockdown databases or public databases. And you can decide where you put each individual pieces file by file within the data set, right? So you have almost complete flexibility. I know some people are saying, right? these are the two things that you actually need in order to get into that system. So there are two commands that you run. One, at the beginning of every project, you run data ref create. Ref is a prefix we don't have to talk about. This creates a data set, right? And then everything else you have to do from there on is to call ref save whenever you think a meaningful milestone has been reached. And that depends on your personal flavor. Every single changed file could be one. You could watch that directory automatically and have this command run all the time. You can apply meaningful messages to this one, which communicate to you what was changed. You can use this like Git. It uses Git underneath. It's just a bit simpler. And this will work with hierarchies of data sets, with Git, which Git cannot do. So you can manage compositions of data sets that you assembled for a particular purpose. So I'll end with that, acknowledging these people who are the core data developers, including Joey Hess, who's amazing, who writes Git Annex. And I encourage you to go to these websites for demos, for example, datalet.org. This is a site, datasets.datalet.org, which runs a stock datalet installation and exposes, I think right now it's something like 14 terabytes of open data from all kinds of portals, which is the data set that you get obtained if you run datalet search. Thanks.